She was a struggling single mom, barely holding it together, until a chance encounter on a plane with a mysterious billionaire changed everything. What started as a quiet act of kindness unraveled a story of second chances, buried dreams, fierce love, and a custody battle that could destroy her world. Ava Bennett didn't ask to be rescued. She asked to be seen, and he did. But who is Cole Maddox, really? And can love survive the secrets he's keeping? Where are you watching from? Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what happens next. Ava Bennett gripped the edge of the bathroom sink, knuckles white, as she stared at her reflection under the harsh, fluorescent lights of the San Diego airport restroom. Her wavy chestnut hair was pulled into a messy bun that had seen better days, and the shadows beneath her hazel eyes looked more like bruises than the product of sleepless nights. She splashed cold water on her face, hoping it would jolt her awake or at least wash away the exhaustion that clung to her like a second skin. But no amount of water could erase the truth. She was running on fumes. She hadn't slept in 2 days, not really. Not since that phone call came. It was just after midnight when Aunt Rachel's voice had cracked through the receiver. "Va, it's your mom. She's not doing well. The doctors. They said it could be any time now." Va had dropped the phone. She hadn't spoken to her mother in over 3 years. Not since the falling out. A lifetime of tension had built up between them, and when Ava had gotten pregnant with Leo and decided to keep the baby against her mother's wishes, the fragile bond they had shattered. But none of that mattered now. She was flying to New York, not because they had made peace, not because everything was okay, but because she couldn't bear the thought of not saying goodbye. The plane ticket had been a miracle in itself. Her bank account had been sitting dangerously close to overdraft when she got the call. Rent was overdue, Leo's kindergarten tuition was coming up, and the diner where she worked was cutting shifts again. It was Aunt Rachel who stepped in and wired the money without hesitation. "Family first," she had said. She couldn't afford pride right now. Leaving Leo this morning had nearly destroyed her. He had clung to her legs, his warm little arms wrapped around her like a life vest. "Why can't I come with you, Mommy?" he'd whispered, his big brown eyes swimming with tears. Ava had crouched down, pressing her forehead to his. "I'll call you every single day," she had promised, forcing a smile she didn't feel. "And I'll bring you something super cool from New York." A lie. But what else could she say? Eric had stood a few feet away, arms crossed, his usual indifferent expression in place. Their relationship had imploded long ago, leaving behind only co-parenting logistics and cold civility. But even he had said, "I'll take care of him. Just do what you have to do." Now, as the airport announcement blared the final boarding call for her flight to New York, Ava bolted from the restroom, heart pounding. She sprinted down the terminal, sneakers squeaking against the polished tile. Her beat-up canvas duffel thumped against her hip as she ran, lungs burning. She reached the gate just as the airline attendant was about to close the door. "Wait, please," she gasped, waving her boarding pass like a flag of surrender. The attendant gave her a once-over, messy hair, flushed face, eyes wild with panic, but then, mercifully, scanned her ticket and stepped aside. 14B. Hurry. Ava stumbled down the jet bridge, her breaths shallow. The plane smelled like old leather and recycled air. She shuffled past the first rows, looking for her seat when she saw him. 14. He looked like he didn't belong on a commercial flight at all, let alone in economy. Tailored navy jacket, crisp white shirt, no tie, top 2 buttons undone. Dark hair, sharply cut jaw, A book in his lap, real leather binding, his fingers poised mid-turn. Ava tried to heave her bag into the overhead compartment, but it was heavier than she remembered. Her arms trembled. She hadn't eaten since yesterday. Without a word, the man stood in one fluid motion and took the bag from her. His hand brushed hers, warm, steady, and she froze. "Let me," he said, a smooth baritone with the faintest hint of a northeastern accent. Ava blinked. "Thanks," she muttered, sliding into her seat. He sat back down, resumed his book, but she felt it. That buzz. That strange, invisible tether that sometimes happened when your path accidentally crossed someone else's. She looked away, toward the window, but sleep clawed at her. The weight of the last 72 hours dragged her under. Her eyes fluttered closed. The last thing she remembered was the rumble of the plane taking off, and the solid warmth of a stranger's shoulder where her head had somehow come to rest. Ava didn't know how long she'd been asleep, only that when she stirred, the cabin was dimmed and the hum of the engines felt like a lullaby that had gone on too long. Her body ached from the angle, but it was the realization of where she was resting that jolted her fully awake. She sat up with a gasp, blinking into the semi-darkness of the plane. Her cheek was warm, too warm, and when she looked to her left, she nearly choked on air. She had been sleeping on the stranger's shoulder. Not just sleeping. Full on, dead, to the world drooling on a designer jacket, kind of sleeping. "Oh my God," she whispered, horrified, brushing her fingers across her lips, as if she could erase the evidence. She reached for his suit jacket, which had somehow slipped around her shoulders, and tried to hand it back, mortification burning through her. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to." "It's fine," he said calmly, taking the jacket without a trace of irritation. His voice was low, steady, like warm bourbon. "You looked like you needed the rest." Ava blinked, stunned. She had braced herself for a sigh, a glare, some passive, aggressive remark about boundaries. But all she got was a small, genuine smile, and that damned voice again, soothing and effortlessly composed. Then, without missing a beat, he pressed the call button overhead. A flight attendant appeared almost immediately, a practiced smile on her face. "Could we get some water, please?" he asked, glancing toward Ava, who was now trying to shrink into the airline seat like it was a sinkhole. "I can get my own," she said quickly, flustered. "I know," he replied, that same easy tone, "but I don't mind." The flight attendant returned moments later with 2 bottles. She handed his over with a warm smile, then turned to Ava with a cooler, polite one. Ava caught the shift. She always did. She twisted the cap off the bottle, grateful for the distraction. A long sip helped calm her nerves, but not the confusion humming through her. Who was this guy? They sat in silence for a moment, the kind that could have been awkward, but somehow wasn't. The man beside her didn't return to his book immediately. Instead, he turned slightly toward her. "Cole Maddox," he said, extending a hand. Ava stared at it for half a second before reaching out to shake it. His grip was firm, warm. Not the kind of handshake that tried to dominate, just one that felt grounded. "Ava Bennett," she replied, finding her voice again. "Ava," he repeated thoughtfully, like he was testing how it sounded. "Nice to meet you." She nodded, suddenly self-conscious about everything. Her hoodie, her worn jeans, the fraying laces on her sneakers. She probably smelled like airport coffee and desperation. Cole, on the other hand, looked like he belonged in a feature spread of Forbes, clean-cut, polished, composed. The contrast between them couldn't have been more obvious. Heading to New York for business or pleasure, he asked, his tone light but curious. Ava let out a soft, humorless laugh. Neither. He raised a brow but didn't press. She appreciated that. After a pause, she asked, "Do you fly this route often?" He nodded slightly. "More than I'd like. Work keeps me on planes more than on the ground." "What do you do?" she asked. There was a flicker of something. Hesitation. Before he answered, business strategy. International markets, mostly. It sounded vague. Purposefully vague. "That explains the suit," she said dryly, earning a smirk. "And you?" She hesitated. "Family emergency." His expression shifted immediately. The casual charm fell away, replaced by something softer, more grounded. "I'm sorry," he said simply. Ava gave a small shrug. "Just hoping I get there in time." He didn't offer empty reassurances, didn't say "I'm sure you will." Instead, he just nodded. That alone was oddly comforting. The rest of the flight passed quietly. Ava dozed off once more, but this time she kept her distance, curled against the window. When the lights brightened and the captain announced their descent, she sat up, heart racing. Almost there. Cole turned to her as the plane leveled out. "Do you have a ride from the airport?" "I was going to grab a cab," she said. He nodded like he expected that, then reached into his jacket and pulled out a sleek black card. "Take my driver's number. He's waiting for me, but he can drop you wherever you need to go." Ava stared at it.
"That's really not necessary."
"I know," he said, holding her gaze. "But I want to." She hesitated. Then, slowly, she took the card. Her fingers brushed his again. "Thank you," she said, quieter this time. Cole smiled, a subtle tilt of the lips that made something flutter inside her chest. For the first time in a very long time, Ava didn't feel completely alone. The cold wind of New York slapped Ava awake the moment she stepped outside the airport. It was different from San Diego, sharper, louder, busier. The city pulsed with an energy she had forgotten. Horns blared, cab drivers yelled over one another, and people moved with the kind of intensity that made her feel like she was already behind. Ava stood still for a moment, duffel bag over her shoulder, trying to breathe in the city's chaos without letting it swallow her whole. A black Bentley pulled up to the curb like a ghost parting traffic. The driver stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing an earpiece that made him look more like security than a chauffeur. His eyes landed on her with calm precision. "Miss Bennett?" he asked. Ava blinked. "Yeah." He opened the door without another word. For half a second she debated running. This was too much. Too fancy, too foreign. But then she remembered the alternative. Flagging down a cab in this madness, with her heart already barely holding together. She slid inside. The car was warm, the seats buttery, soft leather, and the faint scent of something expensive lingered in the air. Cologne, maybe, or just money. The door closed with a soft click, sealing her away from the noise. She looked up and nearly jumped when Cole slid in beside her. "You didn't have to wait," she said quickly. He buckled his seatbelt with practiced ease. "I didn't mind." The driver pulled away from the curb, merging into the chaos of Manhattan traffic with unnerving smoothness. "Where to?" he asked. "Lenox Hill Hospital," Ava replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Cole glanced at her but didn't say anything. She appreciated the silence. She didn't have room for small talk. Her thoughts were spinning too fast. After a few blocks, he spoke again. "Is someone meeting you there?" "My aunt," she said, eyes locked on the blur of buildings outside the window. "She called me 2 nights ago. Said my mom's not doing well. That I should come now. How long has she been sick? A year, Ava said, fingers tightening around the strap of her bag. Cancer. But I thought we had more time. She didn't say what she really meant. That she'd been too proud, too hurt, too afraid to come back sooner. That she had let too many months pass under the false belief there would be a better moment. Cole didn't respond right away. When he did, it wasn't with pity, just quiet understanding. You would come sooner if you could, he said. Ava turned her face away. Yeah. The car fell into silence again, broken only by the low hum of the engine and the distant chaos of city life outside. It felt like they were moving in a bubble, one where time slowed just enough for her to catch her breath. When they pulled up to the hospital entrance, Ava's stomach twisted. The doors loomed ahead like a threshold she wasn't ready to cross. Her chest tightened. Thanks for the ride, she said, reaching for the door handle. Ava. She turned, surprised to hear her name spoken so gently. Cole's expression was different now, less polished, more raw. If you need anything at all, call me. Her fingers froze around the handle. You don't have to do that. I know, he said, but I want to. A beat passed between them. His gaze didn't waver. And for the first time since she had received that phone call, Ava felt like maybe she didn't have to carry everything on her own. She nodded slowly. Okay. Cole reached into his jacket and handed her another card. This one thinner, sleeker. His personal number was embossed in gold along the bottom. She stared at it for a second, then slipped it into her pocket. Take care of yourself, Ava. She stepped out of the car and didn't look back, though she felt his eyes on her all the way to the sliding glass doors. Inside, the hospital smelled like antiseptic and recycled air. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, washing everything in a dull, sterile glow. Her aunt, Rachel, stood by the nurse's station, eyes tired, face drawn. When she saw Ava, something like relief bloomed across her face. You're here, she breathed, pulling her into a hug. Ava clung to her. How is she? She asked, afraid of the answer. Stable, for now, Rachel said. Last night was bad, but she made it through. Ava exhaled, her knees going weak. She had made it, just barely. And somehow, Cole Maddox, a stranger she'd met on a plane, was the one who got her there. Ava stepped outside the hospital after hours of sitting by her mother's bedside, her body stiff, her mind numb. The night air bit at her cheeks, but she welcomed the cold. It felt more real than anything else had all day. She leaned against the concrete wall near the entrance, pulling out her phone for no real reason, just to do something with her hands. That's when she saw the message. Cole Maddox. Just checking in. How's your mom? She stared at the screen, caught off guard. They had barely known each other for 24 hours, and yet, here he was, still there, still showing up in the smallest but most unexpected ways. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard before she typed back, Ava. She's stable for now. It was a long night, but I'm grateful she's still here. The response came, Cole. I'm glad to hear that. I meant it when I said, if you need anything, let me know. She read the words 3 times. There was no pressure in them, no expectation. Just a simple offer. And it was that simplicity that got to her. Ava, you really don't have to keep checking on me, you know. Cole, I know. Her chest tightened. That 2-word reply said more than a paragraph ever could. For years, she had taught herself not to rely on anyone. Not since Leo was born. Not since Leo was born. Not since Eric started drifting further and further into his own world of indifference. But here was Cole. This man she had met in economy class, quietly carving a space for himself in her world without asking for permission. The next morning, she was sitting beside her mother again, watching the heart monitor beep in steady rhythm, when her phone vibrated. She expected another text, but this time it was a call. She hesitated before stepping into the hallway.
Hello?
"Hey!" Cole's voice came through, warm and low. "Have you eaten yet?" Ava blinked.
Not really.
"Good. I'm sending a car. Meet me for breakfast." She blinked again.
Wait, what? Cole, I can't just...
"I'm not saying disappear for hours," he cut in gently. "Just take a break. 1 hour. I'll have you back before your mom even notices you're gone." Ava ran a hand through her tangled hair, glancing toward the hospital room. "I don't know." There was a pause on the line, then his voice softened. "When was the last time you did something for yourself, Ava?" That made her stop cold. She hated how much that landed, because the truth was she couldn't remember. Everything in her life had revolved around Leo, surviving bills, scraping together hours at the diner, and now, sitting in that hospital room waiting for the inevitable. "Fine," she said, exhaling. 1 hour, that's it. I'll be outside in 10. Exactly 10 minutes later, she stood at the curb, arms crossed tightly against the wind. The same black Bentley pulled up, and the driver greeted her with a polite nod before opening the door. "You must think I'm crazy," she muttered under her breath as she slid into the seat. Cole looked up from his phone, that same unreadable calm on his face. "Not at all. You just needed someone to remind you it's okay to take a breath." 15 minutes later, the car pulled up in front of a sleek little cafe nestled between towering glass buildings in Midtown. It wasn't over. The top glamorous, but it was still miles from anything she would have ever chosen on her own. As she stepped out, Cole was already waiting, hands in his coat pockets, eyes locked on her with a look she didn't know how to name. "You made it," he said. "I don't remember agreeing to this," she countered, folding her arms. He smirked. "You always have a choice, Ava." Inside, they were led to a private booth in the back. The waiter greeted Cole like an old friend. "The usual, Mr. Maddox?" "And a latte and breakfast platter for her," he added without missing a beat. Ava raised a brow.
Ordering for me now.
"You look like someone who hasn't had real food in days." She opened her mouth to argue, but yeah, fair. She took a sip of the latte when it arrived, and for a moment, just a moment, she let herself forget the hospital, the heartbreak, the fear. She just sat there across from a man who saw more than he said, and felt the flicker of something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Hope, hope. Ava didn't mean to eat as much as she did, but the second bite of the buttery eggs hit her tongue. Her stomach reminded her just how long it had been since her last real meal. She tried to pace herself, but Cole barely touched his own food, watching her with an amused glint in his eyes that made her self-conscious. "What?" she asked, mouth half full, eyebrows lifted. He shrugged, sipping his coffee. "You just look less exhausted with food in you. It suits you." She rolled her eyes, but couldn't help the slight curve of her lips. "You sure know how to flatter a girl. Comment on her eating habits and her eye bags. Don't forget the caffeine dependency," he added. She laughed, shaking her head. "You're relentless." Cole leaned back, his green eyes softening. Not relentless, just observant. They slipped into a comfortable rhythm after that, the kind that surprised Ava with how easy it felt. He asked about Leo, what he liked, what made him laugh. What made him laugh? What kind of trouble he got into? Ava found herself talking more than she expected. She even pulled out her phone and showed him a photo of her son holding up a homemade dinosaur drawing with a proud, toothy grin. "He's obsessed," she said, passing the phone across the table. Cole studied the image longer than expected. "He's got your eyes," he said finally. Ava smiled, and his dad's stubborn streak. Cole's gaze flicked up. "You two still together?" She shook her head. "We divorced a few years ago. It was complicated, but necessary." He nodded, not pushing. She appreciated that. Most people couldn't resist digging into the mess when they saw the cracks. But Cole didn't seem to need to know everything at once. "You have any siblings?" she asked, changing the subject. "Just one. Younger sister. She's a doctor, lives in Seattle. Works too much." "Sounds like someone I know," Ave said, eyeing him pointedly. Cole gave a slow smile. "Maybe. But I don't wear scrubs." "You probably have someone to iron your suits," she teased. He laughed, and she noticed for the first time how easily it came. Unforced and warm, like it hadn't always been that way. There was something under his polish, a weariness she recognized, a kind of restraint, like someone who was always half a step away from locking the door before anyone could get in. "You don't talk about yourself much," she said without thinking. He raised an eyebrow. "Neither do you." Touch. Touch. There was a pause, and then Cole leaned forward slightly, fingers drumming the edge of the table. "Let's make a deal." Ava squinted. "A deal? You tell me one real thing about yourself. I'll do the same. No surface, level stuff." She hesitated, eyeing him. "You first." He nodded slowly. "All right. I wasn't always in control. When I was younger, life was chaotic. I had to learn to manage everything around me because if I didn't, someone else would. And I couldn't afford to let that happen." Ava didn't expect that level of honesty. It quieted something in her. She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, thinking. "My turn," she asked softly. Cole nodded. "I always thought I'd be more than this," she said, voice quieter now. "I was going to be a journalist. I had scholarships, internships lined up. Then I got pregnant. Leo changed everything. I don't regret him. But somewhere along the way, I stopped dreaming. I just started surviving." Cole didn't speak right away. When he did, his voice was low. "Sure, maybe it's time you start again." Something caught in her throat. She looked at him, really looked at him. The quiet strength, the steadiness, the way he spoke like he actually believed in her. Like he saw more than the tired single mom in worn-out jeans. The sound of a phone buzzing pulled them both out of the moment. Cole glanced at his, silenced it without reading, and looked back at her. "I meant what I said," he added. "You're sharp. Driven. I've met a lot of people with resumes longer than your grocery list who couldn't match your fire. That's rare." Ava flushed, overwhelmed and unsure how to respond. Compliments like that weren't part of her world. She finished the last sip of her coffee and set the cup down, exhaling. "You're dangerous. You know that?" Cole's smile was slow and knowing. "So I've been told." She shook her head, but the smile lingered. And for the first time in years, Ava Bennett felt something that almost scared her more than anything else. Hope. Again. 2 days later, the dress arrived at her door like a challenge wrapped in silk and secrecy. Ava stared at the sleek box resting on her doormat, her name written in careful, looping script on a card tucked beneath the black ribbon. She hesitated before picking it up, already knowing who it was from. There was no return address, no fanfare, just quiet certainty. That was Cole's style. Never flashy, always intentional. She carried it inside like it might explode. Inside, nestled in tissue paper that probably cost more than her favorite sweater, was the most beautiful dress she'd ever seen. Midnight blue, sleek, with beaded detailing that shimmered like city lights in motion. The fabric felt like water against her skin when she ran her fingers over it. She held it up, breath-catching. It was perfect, and completely wrong for her world. She hadn't officially agreed to go to gala. She'd told Cole she'd think about it, and now here she was, holding proof that he'd never doubted her answer. "You're ridiculous," she muttered aloud, not sure if she meant herself or him. But when Saturday night came, she found herself slipping into the dress anyway, her hands trembling as she zipped it up. She hadn't worn anything this elegant since prom, and that had been borrowed and 2 sizes too big. Now, as she looked in the mirror, even with her hair pinned up loosely and her makeup minimal, she barely recognized herself. She looked like someone who belonged in Cole Maddox's world. She didn't believe it, not for a second, but she looked the part. When the Bentley pulled up in front of her building, Ava hesitated only briefly before stepping out and sliding into the back seat. The driver gave her a small nod through the mirror, then pulled into traffic. She stared out at the blur of Manhattan lights, nerves coiling in her stomach like live wires. She didn't know why she was doing this. Maybe curiosity, maybe something more dangerous. The ballroom shimmered with chandeliers and the kind of quiet wealth that didn't need to announce itself. Everything was polished, crystal, marble, laughter. Waiters floated past with champagne flutes balanced on silver trays, and music swelled softly from a live string quartet. Ava stepped inside and froze. Cole stood near the bar, impossibly sharp in a black tux, his dark hair slicked back, his posture effortless. When his eyes found her, something shifted in his expression. The calm, composed man she'd come to know tilted his head slightly, and for just a second, looked completely disarmed. He walked toward her with measured strides, his gaze never leaving hers. "You showed up," he said, voice low, admiring. "You didn't leave me much room to back out," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "You look," he paused, searching for the word, "unreal." She smiled despite herself. "And you're still dangerous. Only if you're not paying attention." He offered his arm, and she took it. Her heels clicked softly against the marble as they crossed the room, and Ava tried not to shrink into herself as heads turned to look at them. She wasn't used to being noticed, not like this. But next to Cole, she couldn't disappear, not even if she wanted to. They made small talk with politicians, CEOs, artists, and Ava somehow held her own, relying on instincts sharpened by years of observing strangers from behind a diner counter. She listened, smiled, nodded in the right places. Cole never left her side. But just when she was starting to feel like she might survive the night, she heard someone say her name. Bennett, right?" She turned, eyebrows drawn together, and found herself face to face with a woman in a crimson gown that clung to her like it had been painted on. Sleek, dark hair, cold smile. "Yes," Ava said slowly. The woman extended a hand, her nails lacquered in the same shade as her dress. "I'm Isabel." Ava's stomach dipped. The name was familiar. Too familiar. Isabel's smile widened, but it never reached her eyes. It's always fascinating to see who Cole brings to these things. He usually keeps his Personal life separate from events like this. Ava stiffened, a chill crawling down her spine. Do you know Cole well? Isabel's voice was silky. We were engaged. Once. Ava didn't respond. Couldn't. Isabel leaned in just enough to whisper, "Be careful. He's good at keeping secrets." Then she turned and disappeared into the crowd, her red dress slicing through the room like a warning. Ava stood frozen for a beat before searching for Cole. When she found him, she didn't wait for him to notice her expression. She walked up to him, her voice low and sharp. "Who's Isabel?" Cole's jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing just slightly. And just like that, the polished night cracked open. Nothing about this was simple anymore. Cole didn't flinch. Not right away. But Ava saw it, the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers curled slightly at his side. He looked at her, really looked, and something behind those polished green eyes dimmed just a little. "She told you," he said quietly. Ava crossed her arms, the weight of the night settling heavy on her shoulders. She didn't have to say much. Her tone did most of the work. Cole exhaled, glancing away for a beat before returning his gaze to hers. It was a long time ago. "And you weren't going to mention it?" Ava asked, voice tight. "It wasn't relevant." "It feels relevant," she countered, especially when she walks up to me in the middle of a ballroom and makes it sound like I'm the next clueless girl in a very long line. Cole's face shifted, less guarded now, more raw. "You're not." "How am I supposed to know that?" Ava asked, and the question slipped out sharper than she intended. Her heart was thudding in her chest. "I barely know anything about you, Cole. You show up, you help, you make me feel like I'm not alone. And then I find out I'm the second woman tonight who's worn your jacket." His expression flickered, just slightly. "Isabel and I were engaged. Yes," he said, steady but quiet. It wasn't love. Not the way you're thinking. It was strategic. Our families, her father and mine. Pushed it. It made business sense. For a while, I convinced myself it might work." Ava stared at him, trying to decide if that made it better or worse. "She didn't want it more than I could give," Cole continued, voice lower now. "She mistook success for connection. I walked away before we ever set a date. She never quite forgave that." Ava let the silence stretch between them. People moved around them, laughing, sipping champagne, completely unaware that her entire night had flipped on its axis. She hated how her chest still ached, hated how much she wanted to believe him. "So what now?" she asked, not bothering to mask the weariness in her voice. Cole looked at her like she was the only person in the room. "That depends on you." She blinked. "I can't promise you I've been perfect," he said. "But I haven't lied to you, Ava. Not once. I may not have told you everything, but I never pretended to be someone else." "No," she admitted softly, "you didn't." They stood in that bubble of uncertainty for what felt like hours. And then Cole stepped closer, his voice gentler this time. "Come outside with me, please." Ava hesitated for just a second before following him through the ballroom doors into the quiet hush of the rooftop terrace. The city stretched out around them like a living thing, glittering, unrelenting, too big for either of them to hold. He turned to face her, hands in his pockets now, as if keeping them there would stop him from reaching for her. "I'm not used to letting people in," he admitted. "It's easier to keep things compartmentalized, controlled. But you wrecked that system." She let out a shaky laugh. "I'm not trying to wreck anything." "I know," he said. "That's what makes it worse." Ava wrapped her arms around herself, feeling suddenly cold despite the summer night. "I don't know how to do this either, Cole. I've spent years trying to survive. Working double shifts, worrying about Leo, trying not to fall apart. I don't do casual. I don't do casual. I don't do temporary. I'm not offering you temporary. She looked at him, eyes searching. Then, what are you offering? His voice was barely above a whisper. Whatever you'll let me give. Something in her cracked open at that. Slowly. Carefully. And even though the air between them was still thick with uncertainty, Ava took a step closer. I don't want to be someone you hide, she said. You won't be, Cole replied, firm now. Not ever. She didn't kiss him, not then. But she didn't walk away either. And that, for both of them, was enough. At least for tonight. Ava's phone buzzed as she stepped out of the office building, still adjusting to the rhythm of her new job. The city had started to blur. Her days now a cycle of hospital visits, writing deadlines, and trying not to think too hard about Cole Maddox. But the name flashing across her screen wasn't his. It was Eric. Her stomach sank. She hadn't heard from her ex in weeks, not since the last tense exchange about Leo's pickup schedule. And now, suddenly, he was calling out of the blue. She debated letting it go to voicemail, but something told her this wasn't the kind of message he'd leave. She answered.
Hello.
We need to talk. Eric's voice was clipped, businesslike. About what? About Leo. Leo. Her heart skipped. What about him? I don't want to get into it over the phone, he said. Can we meet tonight? Ava clenched her jaw. Fine, my place, 7. She hung up without waiting for a response. For the rest of the day, her thoughts wouldn't settle. She tried to write, but every time she looked at her laptop, her mind filled with worst-case scenarios. Eric had never tried anything bold before, mostly because he couldn't be bothered. But something had shifted in him lately. He'd seemed colder, smarter, even. She didn't like it. By the time evening fell, her nerves were frayed. At 7:04 p.m., there was a knock on her apartment door. Eric stood on the other side, still in his corporate, casual uniform. Pressed slacks, gray button-down, and that expression he wore when he thought he had the upper hand. Ava stepped aside, folding her arms as he walked in. Cut to it, she said. What's going on? Eric didn't waste time. He pulled a manila folder from his bag and dropped it on the kitchen table. I'm filing for primary custody. The words hit like a slap. Ava stared at him, blinking. You're what? I've already spoken to a lawyer. I think Leo would be better off with me. More stability. I make more, live in a safer neighborhood. You barely see him, she shouted, her voice cracking. You pick him up late, drop him off early, you don't even know what his favorite book is. Eric remained unmoved. You work long hours. Your mother is sick. You just started a new job. It's not a stable environment. Ava felt the blood drain from her face. You're using my mom's illness against me? I'm using facts, he replied coolly. Her hands curled into fists at her sides.
You're doing this to hurt me.
Eric tilted his head. I'm doing this because I think it's best for Leo. Ava swallowed hard, her vision going blurry with rage and panic. Get out. Eric stood without argument, like he'd already accomplished what he came for. You'll be hearing from my lawyer. The door clicked shut behind him, and Ava stood frozen in her kitchen, trying not to fall apart. 15 minutes later, her phone was in her hand again, almost without her realizing it. She stared at the screen, Cole's name lit up in the messages, her thumb hovering over it. She didn't want to pull him into this. He had already done too much. But then she remembered his voice on that rooftop. Whatever you'll let me give. She pressed call. He answered on the second ring. Ava, I need to see you, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Where are you? Home. I'm on my way. 20 minutes later, Cole was at her door. When she opened it, he didn't speak. He just looked at her, really looked, and whatever he saw must have said enough. She let him inside, sat down slowly. The apartment felt smaller tonight. He didn't take off his coat, just moved to sit beside her, hands on his knees, waiting. My ex is trying to take Leo from me. Cole's jaw tightened. On what grounds? Because I'm working, because my mom's sick, because I don't live in a 3-bedroom condo with a view of the river, she snapped bitterly. Because he can. Cole was silent for a long beat, then, softly, let me help. Ava shook her head. I can't ask you to. You didn't ask. She looked at him, eyes shimmering with unshed tears. Because you're not alone in this, Ava, he said. Not anymore. She broke then, just a little, not into tears, but into something more dangerous, trust. And even though she didn't know how this would end, for the first time, she let someone stay when things got messy. Ava sat across from the attorney, the sleek office window framing a gray Manhattan skyline behind her. She hadn't slept more than a few hours since Eric dropped the custody bomb, and it showed. Her hair was pulled back in a messy knot, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion. But she was there. She was fighting. I reviewed the paperwork Eric filed. The attorney, a sharp woman named Camille Hart, said evenly. It's aggressive. He's going for full custody, claiming emotional instability, financial insecurity, and inconsistent care due to your mother's illness. Ava's throat went dry. He's weaponizing my life against me. Camille nodded. That's exactly what it is. A narrative. He's painting a picture that works in court, even if it's not the truth. But we can counter it. You're employed. You're employed. Your son is safe. You've maintained full custody for years with no issues. That matters. Ava inhaled deeply, then nodded. What do I need to do? Document everything. Every interaction. Get character references, teachers, neighbors, anyone who's seen you with Leo. We'll fight this. Ava's phone buzzed just as she was gathering her things. A text from Cole. Cole, are you free for lunch? She stared at the screen, unsure. So much had changed in a matter of days. Her world was cracking open, and Cole was the one person who kept showing up, offering quiet steadiness in the middle of her storm. Ava, sure, 1 hour. He sent a location, an intimate, tucked, away bistro near Central Park. When she arrived, he was already there, seated outside beneath a patio heater, sipping espresso like he belonged in a black and white film. She slid into the seat across from him. I still don't understand how you find places like this. He shrugged, offering a small smile. Habit. They ordered quickly, and Ava wasted no time. Eric's going for full custody, she said flatly. Cole's expression darkened. On what grounds? Everything he can think of. My mom, my job. He says Leo would be more stable with him. Cole set his coffee down. You're not alone in this, Ava. I meant what I said. She looked at him carefully. You keep saying that. But this is different. I know. It could get ugly. He met her gaze, steady and unflinching. I've seen ugly. I'm still here. Ava wanted to argue, wanted to say she didn't need saving. But she didn't. Because deep down, she knew she couldn't do this alone. He pulled out a small folder and slid it toward her. What's this? She asked, opening it. Contact information for a top custody attorney. One of the best in New York. I've already briefed her. Ava looked up sharply. Cole, I can't afford. You're not paying for it, he said simply. Her breath caught. I didn't ask for this. I know, but I'm giving it anyway. She shook her head, overwhelmed. This is too much. No, Ava. What you're carrying. That's too much. Let someone carry part of it for once. She swallowed hard, the words pressing against her chest. Cole paused, then leaned forward. You. That stopped her. He didn't say it like a line. He didn't say it like a demand. Just truth. I don't want to be someone who walks away when things get complicated, he added. Not when it comes to you. Ava looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting the edge of a paper napkin. The part of her that had lived in survival mode for years. The part that expected everything good to fall apart. Wanted to run. But another part, deeper and quieter, whispered, stay.
So she looked up and whispered, okay.
That night, as she sat at her mother's bedside, Leo's voice echoed through the phone during their nightly call. Mommy, did you know stegosauruses had brains in their butts? She laughed. Is that so? That's what Mr. Benton said. I can tell you more tomorrow. I'd love that, she said, smiling through tears. And as she hung up, the weight on her chest didn't disappear, but it lightened. Because for the first time in a long time, she wasn't standing alone. Ava stood outside Callahan Media headquarters on Monday morning, her heart hammering like it wanted out of her chest. The glass tower loomed above her, modern and sleek, reflecting a version of the city that always seemed out of reach. She had barely slept the night before. Between the custody case, her mom's fragile condition, and the whirlwind that was Cole Maddox, she felt like she was constantly trying to keep her head above water. But she was here. Inside, the lobby buzzed with activity. People in tailored coats and polished shoes moving with purpose. Ava approached the front desk and gave her name. The receptionist smiled, tapping something into the computer before handing her a visitor badge. 25th floor. Ms. Grant is expecting you. The elevator ride felt eternal. She tried to steady her breathing, tried not to fidget with the strap of her bag. She hadn't been in a real office building in years. The last time she had worn business clothes, Leo wasn't even born. When the elevator doors slid open, Charlotte Grant was already there, tall, impeccably dressed, and with the kind of presence that could command a room with a single raised brow. Ava Bennett, she said crisply. Follow me. No welcome. No small talk. Ava scrambled to keep up as they passed glass, walled offices and rows of busy desks. Phones rang. Keyboards clacked. The newsroom was alive with the kind of electricity she remembered chasing once, back when writing had felt like her future. Charlotte stopped beside an empty desk near a window. This is yours. Computer setup. You'll get your login credentials by email. Ava glanced at the desk. Neat, sterile, but real. Tangible. Charlotte turned to her. I don't believe in handouts. Leah may have opened the door, but if you can't walk through it and stand on your own, you won't last here. Ava lifted her chin. I wouldn't expect anything less. Charlotte smirked, almost approving. Good. Welcome to Callahan Media. With that, she disappeared into the sea of desks. Ava sat down slowly, letting it all sink in. She had a desk. An eyed badge. A fresh start. It was terrifying and exhilarating. For the next few hours, she buried herself in emails and orientation tasks, trying to absorb everything. The work was real, fast, competitive, but she kept up. She wasn't just some charity case Liam had dropped into the building. She was good. Rusty, sure, but not broken. Mid-afternoon, her phone buzzed. A message from Liam. Liam, how's the first day, rookie? Ava, your editor might actually be a hit woman in disguise. Liam, that's why she's the best. She grinned despite herself. Ava, I think I might die. Liam, you won't. You're tougher than you think. A pause. Liam, dinner tonight. You owe me for the job hookup. Ava, one dinner, that's it. Liam, we'll see. She rolled her eyes but didn't stop smiling. Later that evening, they met at a restaurant that was fancy by her standards, but casual by his. Low lighting, exposed brick, a skyline view. She wore the nicest thing in her closet that wasn't the gala dress and still felt a little underdressed. But the second Liam looked at her, she stopped caring. You clean up nice, he said, pulling out her chair. And you just never look bad, do you? She replied, arching a brow. He gave a half smile. I have my off days. She laughed. Doubt it. Dinner was easy, too easy. They talked about everything. Leo, journalism, his ridiculous schedule, her mother's steady progress. Somewhere between the second glass of wine and dessert, Ava found herself relaxing into his presence again. Dangerous, she thought, but undeniably warm. As the waiter cleared their plates, Liam leaned in. Still think this is just one dinner? Ava shook her head, a wry smile playing on her lips. You're impossible. I've been called worse. She met his eyes, and for a moment, the noise of the restaurant faded. Something was happening, something real. And for the first time in years, Ava wasn't running from it. Ava had just stepped out of the newsroom when her phone rang again. She didn't even have to check the screen to know who it was. The rhythm of her day had started to include Cole Maddox in ways she hadn't meant to allow. She hesitated for a beat before answering. Hey, she said, trying to sound breezy. You sound tired, Cole said gently. That's because I am. There was a pause. What are you doing this weekend? Not sure yet. Probably catching up on laundry and figuring out how to keep my life from collapsing. Well, he said, voice laced with that infuriating charm of his, how about putting all that on hold for one night? I need a date to a charity gala. Ava stopped walking. A gala. Like gowns and champagne, and people who casually donate 6 figures before dessert? That would be the one. She laughed, half in disbelief. Cole, I'm not the gala type. You wore that navy dress better than anyone in that room, and you know it. She rolled her eyes.
You don't take no for an answer, do you?
Only when I know someone wants to say yes. She could practically hear his smirk through the phone. I'll think about it, she said. I already sent a dress. Of course you did. 2 days later, the box arrived. Again. Sleek. Elegant. Intimidating. The gown inside was a deep emerald green that shimmered like moonlight on water. She didn't even want to try it on. But of course she did. And just like the last time, it fit like it had been made for her. And when she looked in the mirror, for one fleeting moment, she believed she could belong in Cole Maddox's world. The night of the gala, Cole was already waiting when her car pulled up. Black tux. Classic watch. A look that said he owned every room he walked into. But the second he saw her, his entire expression changed. You look. His words trailed off. I know, she teased, trying to keep it light, but his gaze didn't waver. You don't understand, he said, stepping closer. Everyone else tonight will be pretending. You don't have to. The ballroom was even more dazzling than the last. Gold accents, towering flower arrangements, live music that wrapped itself around the guests like silk. Ava walked beside him, her arm in his trying to quiet the voice in her head that kept saying, "You don't belong here." But Cole never treated her like an accessory. He introduced her by name, not as his guest, and always with a quiet reverence in his voice that said she mattered. Midway through the evening, as she sipped a glass of champagne, she caught him watching her. "What?" she asked. "You surprise me." "How so?" "You walk into a world you weren't born into and carry yourself like you built it." She laughed, softly. "That's rich coming from you." His smile faded into something more serious. "I wasn't born into this either." She tilted her head. "You weren't?" "No. Brooklyn. 1-bedroom apartment. My dad worked nights at a packaging plant. My mom was a nurse. This." He gestured around the room. "I built this brick by brick." Ava blinked. "Why? Haven't you told me that before?" "You never asked." They stood in silence for a moment, surrounded by glittering laughter and clinking glasses. Then Ava said softly, "I used to want to be a journalist. Not just any journalist, the kind who chased truth and shook up the system. But I let go of that dream when Leo came along. Maybe it's time to pick it back up. I wouldn't even know where to start." "I do," Cole said. "I own a media company. You're already working at Callahan Media. But what if you came in as more than a staff writer? What if I gave you the chance to really chase the stories that matter?" Ava stared at him. "You offering me another job?" "I'm offering you a shot at everything you thought you lost." She didn't know whether to laugh or cry. "Why are you doing this?" He leaned closer, voice low. "Because I see you, Ava. Not just the tired single mom. Not the waitress you used to be. I see who you are underneath all the survival. And I think the world deserves to see it too." Her heart thundered. She didn't say yes, not yet. But in that moment, she knew one thing for sure. She was never going to be the same again. Ava stared at her phone long after the call had ended. Charlotte Grant's voice still echoed in her ears. Cool, authoritative, impossible to ignore. "We have a staff writer position. No favors. No shortcuts." She had 24 hours to decide. That night, Ava barely slept. She lay on the couch in her tiny apartment, the city humming outside her window, her thoughts spinning. Leo was asleep in the other room, his soft breathing. The only thing grounding her mother was still in the hospital, but doing better. Cole's name was still lingering at the top of her text thread. She could stay safe, stick with what she knew. But then again, what had safety ever really gotten her? By sunrise, her decision was made. She dialed the number with shaking fingers. "Charlotte, I'll take the job." There was a pause. Then a crisp reply. "Good." Ava hung up and exhaled so deeply she didn't realize she'd been holding her breath for hours. That Monday, Ava stood outside Callahan Media. This time, not as a favor, not as a guest, but as someone who had earned her place. The nerves were still there, twisting beneath her skin, but there was something else too. Determination. Charlotte met her with the same no-nonsense energy. "You're late," she said, even though Ava was 5 minutes early. Ava smiled. Noted. The newsroom was buzzing. Reporters on calls, editors hunched over screens, interns dashing between desks with coffee and chaos. Charlotte led her to a corner with a modest desk, a second-hand chair, and a view of a brick wall. "This is yours, for now." "I've had worse," Ava said. Charlotte gave her a look. "Prove you deserve better." "I plan to—" Hours passed in a blur of emails, onboarding, and absorbing the cadence of a newsroom again. Ava fell into it naturally. Like her body remembered what it was to chase a story, to write not just for survival, but for purpose. Her first assignment was a piece on a city council housing policy, hardly glamorous, but important. Midway through her notes, her phone buzzed. Cole. "So, how's it feel to take over the world?" "Ava. Feels like I'm starting from the bottom of it." "Cole. That's where all the best stories begin." She smiled, typing back. "Ava, I'll owe you a drink if I survive this first week." "Cole. Deal. But it's not a drink if you owe me. It's a date." Ava rolled her eyes, but didn't reply. Not yet. Later that night, after Leo was tucked in and the apartment was quiet, Ava sat on her couch rereading the draft she'd been working on. She hadn't felt this alive in years, not just from the work, but from the possibility of rebuilding, of redefining herself. A knock on the door broke her focus. She opened it to find Cole standing there, a single white tulip in hand. "I figured it was time I made an official appearance," he said with a small smile. Ava blinked. "You brought me a flower?" "It's symbolic." "Of what?" "Fresh starts. Tulips always come back, no matter how rough the winter." Ava stared at him, heart tightening. "You're not what I expected," she said softly. "Neither are you," he replied. "That's what makes this interesting." She stepped aside to let him in. Over takeout containers and low music, they talked about everything and nothing. Cole told her about his sister, about his first apartment in Brooklyn with a hole in the ceiling and no heat. Ava told him about her first story in college, the one that got her noticed by the campus paper. The one she still remembered word for word. By the time he left, it was nearly midnight. He paused at the door, his hand brushing hers. "Whatever happens with the custody case, the job, your mom, I'm here," he said. "Not just when it's easy." She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Because for the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was fighting alone. She felt like maybe, just maybe, she was finally beginning again. And this time, on her own terms. Life lesson. Life lesson. Ava's journey is a reminder that starting over is not a weakness. It's an act of courage. For years, she survived, believing that her dreams were buried beneath responsibilities, heartbreak, and fear. But it wasn't until she allowed herself to hope again, to open her heart and accept help, that her life began to change. Her story teaches us that it's never too late to rewrite your narrative. Whether you're a single parent, someone recovering from loss, or simply stuck in a life that doesn't feel like your own, you have the power to begin again. Sometimes, it takes one unexpected encounter, one person who sees you beyond your struggle, to spark a transformation. But the real shift comes when you start seeing yourself that way too. Love doesn't always arrive in the most predictable forms. Support can come from places you least expect. But the strength to accept it, to trust again, and to rebuild, that strength has always been yours. No matter how messy your past has been, your future is still unwritten, and you have every right to make it something beautiful. If you've made it this far, thank you for being part of Ava's journey. We hope her story inspired you in some way. Let us know in the comments, what part of Ava's story moved you the most? Have you ever had to start over? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another powerful story like this one. Your support helps us bring more heartfelt, life-changing stories to life. See you in the next one.